The U.S. men's national team just announced their first call-up in 12 months for games in November. But this roster looks a little bit different to one that we might expect the USMNT to have going forward. What's the reason for that? And what can we learn from this roster that might actually carry over going forward? Let's discuss. So Greg Berhalter and the USMNT camp called up this 24-man roster for two friendlies in November. I believe November 12th against Wales and November 16th against Panama. So players will report on November 8th, and this will be the first time that the USMNT has gotten together in 12 months. So we're probably going to see a lot of new faces, and I want to jump right into talking about this roster because the first thing that you probably noticed is that there are no MLS players on the roster. None whatsoever. Now, the first thing that I want to say is this has been addressed. This wasn't an accident. Greg Berhalter said that he is intentionally not calling up MLS players this time because he wanted them to stay with their clubs for the end of the MLS season and then the playoffs going forward. But I think there's more to this than meets the eye, or at least what Berhalter has said. So we'll talk about that in a minute because that's really what I want to get to with this video. I do want to obviously highlight some players that you should keep your eye on right now. Serginho Dest coming in. He has been playing for Barcelona. He's actually been getting game time for Barcelona recently, including in the Champions League. So this is a kid that is up and coming. Chris Richards out of Bayern Munich. People seem to be very, very high on him. Tyler Adams making his way back. He's been injured for the better part of the last year, but he's back and he's playing well. And I think he's a key for what Berhalter and the U.S. are going to do going forward. Weston McKennie obviously has been playing for Juventus. Owen Otasowie, Otasowie, I think is how you pronounce it. He is, I believe, a 17-year-old kid from England who has not declared his national team yet. I don't think. I could be wrong on that. So that's someone that the U.S. is really looking to get in with early. Christian Pulisic is back, our Lord and Savior Christian Pulisic. You love to see him. And Gio Reyna out of Borussia Dortmund getting his first call-up. This is a guy that he is maybe the top young prospect in the team right now. He is just 17, I believe. And people really, really like Gio Reyna. So that's going to be someone to watch. Several guys making their first, getting their first call-ups here. Guys who have had no caps for the U.S. national team. Yunus Musa, the midfielder, Conrad de la Fuente, Nicolas Gioacchini. So what you're probably noticing is these are younger players that are all playing overseas. Several Barcelona players in here, Borussia Dortmund, Chelsea, Man City. These are players that are playing for big teams. And I think that's really important. I think that's really important to note. U.S. players, whether it's guys like Dest or Gio Reyna that are projects for the future and may or may not end up with Barcelona or Borussia Dortmund, or a guy like Christian Pulisic, who is very much the future of Chelsea and is in the plans going forward for Chelsea, hopefully for a long time. We're seeing the U.S. really be represented really well in some of these really big teams that people know. Even if you're not a huge soccer fan, if you've watched it all, you probably know who Man City is. You probably know who Barcelona is. You probably know who Juventus is, and the U.S. has players on those teams. I think that's really worth noting. And this brings me into this discussion about the lack of MLS players. There's two ways to look at this, I think. Like I said, Greg Berhalter said that he is intentionally not calling them up. He wants them to stay here for MLS playoffs, the end of the MLS season. And one thing that he said that actually I think is very interesting is he compared the way that he wants to work with the MLS to national teams in Europe. He said, "It's another example of the United States Soccer Federation working with MLS to benefit the clubs, and I think that is important because other countries aren't necessarily doing that. There are some core players that were leaving off this roster because of that, but we felt that we have enough depth in Europe right now to field a good roster, and we're looking forward to working with these guys." That's a very, very interesting point, I think, from Berhalter, saying that he wants the U.S. Soccer Federation to work very closely with the MLS. And we have actually seen in the past potentially antagonistic relationships, maybe not antagonistic, but at the very least not necessarily friendly relationships between the football associations and the leagues of different countries. So it's very interesting. And the MLS does not get the advantage of getting to plan their schedule around international breaks like the leagues in Europe do. They do get that advantage. So teams don't have to play while their best players are getting called up, but the MLS does. So I think the U.S. Soccer Federation working with the MLS to try to work around that and make sure that the MLS is not left out, and there is a balance between the two, in that, you know, we don't have to say, oh, if there's an international break, that means that, you know, a bunch of great MLS players are leaving, and so there's no point in watching the MLS for this 2 weeks or however long that they're going to be gone. That's apparently not going to happen, or at least according to this is something that Greg Berhalter wants to ensure happens going forward. And I think that it's good that our soccer federation is going to be working with the MLS, considering that the MLS is really not the training ground for the US's top stars anymore. And this is the real point that I wanted to make. When you look at this roster of call-ups, the guys who have had more experience with the US national team, guys like Christian Pulisic, Weston McKennie, Tyler Adams, these are guys who did not come from the MLS. These are guys that trained overseas, that lived overseas, I believe, for most of their lives. And when you look at the guys that are on the way up, Josh Sargent, Tim Weah, Gio Reyna, Serginho Dest, and then some of these very young guys like Owen Otasawi and Yunus Musa. These are guys that have never stepped foot in the MLS and have never stepped foot in an MLS academy. And I think that seeing the way that this roster actually breaks down is very, very interesting for me, because when this kind of mirrors the way that Germany built up their national team when they were in a not so low a place as the US was in 2018, missing that World Cup, but Germany was certainly heavily underperforming the way that they had in the past around 2000, and they completely blew up their the way that they did their national team. And a big key to that was to say, we're going to send our players out so that they can get experience in the top leagues right now, because at that time the Bundesliga is not one of the top leagues in Europe. So we're going to send them out, get them experience. They're going to come back to the national team. They're going to excel with the national team, and that's going to help fuel money pumped in and fuel enthusiasm for the Bundesliga, and then hopefully they will come back and build the Bundesliga. And now you look at 20 years later, and the German top division is one of the best, if not the best, leagues in the world. Germany as a national team is one of the best national teams in the world, and obviously they won the 2014 World Cup. So it obviously worked, and that seems to be what the US is doing. I think the US at this point is saying, look, in an ideal world, we want to take players from the MLS. We want to take our home league, and that's who we want to represent us, because England does that, and Spain does that, and now Germany does that. Europe mostly, all of these European countries, a lot of their top players stay home. And I think the US is saying, that's something we want. But it's not attainable right now. You're not going to convince Christian Pulisic to come to the MLS when he has this great role at Chelsea. You're not going to convince Josh Sargent or Tim Weah or Tyler Adams, who have such promising careers, to come back to the U.S. where they're not going to get that same level of competition. You're not going to convince a guy like Zach Steffen to stay when Manchester City is knocking on his door, even though he's the backup or the third string at Man City. Look, they're still paying him probably 10 times as much, so you're not going to convince him to stay. When you're Serginho Dest, you don't have Barcelona calling and then say, no, I'm sorry, I'm actually going to go join the Columbus Crew or something. It's just not going to happen. And so while Greg Berhalter is paying lip service to the idea that there are important players in the MLS, which, you know, there are guys in the MLS right now. Jordan Morris is playing really well. Giassi Zardes is playing really well. Josie Altidore obviously has been a huge part of the U.S. men's national team for a decade plus. So yeah, there are pieces in the MLS, but are they important? When you're looking at the future of the U.S. national team, you're looking at Zach Steffen, you're looking at Dest, you're looking at Matt Miazga, in my opinion, you're looking at Anthony Robinson, Tyler Adams, Weston McKennie, Christian Pulisic, Gio Reyna, Josh Sargent, Tim Weah. That's who you're looking at. I don't think there's really anyone in the MLS that you're looking at and saying this guy is going to be a future star of this team. I think you're saying at best this guy's going to be a consistent call-up for this team that can get in and get the job done. A guy like Reggie Cannon, who I think has been playing really, really well, and even he just moved to Boavista in Spain. So even Reggie Cannon looked at it and said, the MLS not really the place that I want to be right now. What it all boils down to, in my opinion, is the distancing of the U.S. men's national team from Major League Soccer, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. We've had fans for years complain about how the MLS does not pump out the level of players that the U.S. needs to compete on the national level because, you know, they may be good enough to beat Trinidad and Tobago. Well, maybe not, apparently, judging by 2016. But in general, they may be good enough to beat Trinidad and Tobago. They may be good enough to beat Panama. But are they good enough to beat Mexico? Are they good enough to beat Argentina? Are they good enough to beat Brazil? All that we've seen from the MLS right now is no, they're not. So I think the U.S. is making a conscious decision to say that we are going to prioritize players that are currently getting the best experience possible overseas, and we're gonna prioritize players that are getting the best experience playing the best talent possible overseas, and we believe that those are the guys that are going to be able to compete for the national team and hopefully win some games. Honestly, I can't even argue at this point. I don't think that if you look at a potential starting lineup, any of them would be replaced by players that are currently playing in the MLS. Maybe Jordan Morris gets in there. Maybe. but I don't even know about that. It depends on how well Sargent and Weah are playing for that to happen. Bottom line, I don't think that we're going to see the MLS play a big role in the U.S. men's national team for a little while. I think the U.S. men's national team is going to be comprised of players that are getting their caps overseas, that are playing in Europe, that are playing a lot in Europe, and players that are going to continue to be important players for these top teams. I mean, you look at the difference Christian Pulisic makes when he gets into the Chelsea squad. You look at the difference that Weston McKennie has made when he gets into the Juventus squad. Hopefully Serginho Dest can work into that same kind of role. And guys like Tim Ream and Anthony Robinson are out at Fulham. Tyler Adams makes a huge difference when he's in for Leipzig. So these aren't just guys that are there riding the pine and then coming over to the U.S. These are guys that are actively playing and actively contributing to some of the top teams in Europe, some of the top teams in the world right now. And in my opinion, the U.S. should be looking at this and saying, you know what? Well, let's forget about the MLS, because long term, what's going to help the MLS is the growth of soccer as a sport in the United States, and what helps that is the USMNT being something that people can be proud of, because we as US fans were not proud of them in 2016, nor should we have been. And the Gold Cup in 2018 was a taste of a kind of team that I did enjoy watching, that I was proud of, because there's a lot of great players. You know, Christian Pulisic, was the best player on the field when the U.S. played Mexico, in my opinion. He was the best player on the field. He didn't necessarily play the best game, but he was the best player on the field. And when was the last time that you could say that as a U.S. fan? I don't think that even when Landon Donovan was at his prime, that he was better than every single player on the Mexican national team. I truly believe that Christian Pulisic is better than every single player in the Mexican national team. For that matter, I think Christian Pulisic right now is the best player in CONCACAF, hands down. And he's out playing in England. He's not coming back to the MLS. So guys like Christian Pulisic are going to be the driving force for growing soccer in the United States, which then helps the MLS grow, and then eventually maybe we'll see the trickle in of guys like Pulisic and Adams and McKinney and Dest, Sargent, Weah, towards the ends of their careers, they're going to come back and help grow the sport, and then maybe the MLS can start home growing players that will make a difference going forward for the USMNT. I think this, even though Greg Berhalter says that he does it intentionally and he fully intends for MLS players to be back in the squad, I think that what we're seeing now is a window into the future of the USMNT, at least until 2026, where hopefully there's a great run in the World Cup, if not later, depending on how well the US does in that tournament. But I could be wrong. And I do want to make one correction. Reggie Cannon plays for Boa Vista in Portugal, not in Spain. So one correction there. But look, I could be wrong about anything. So let's go down to the comments. Let's have a discussion. I want to hear from you guys what you think. And if you think that this is a good decision for the U.S. to on its face, distance itself from the MLS, or should the USMNT be building from the ground up with more kind of tentacles in the MLS as opposed to kind of the distancing that we've seen in the past. So let me know in the comments, and subscribe so that we can talk more, because I like talking with you guys. We appreciate you.